This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and today we're continuing with my Throne of Eldraine limited set review. We've already looked at white and blue, and today we're continuing by looking at every card in black in Throne of Eldraine. Before we delve into our first card, if you aren't familiar with how I grade these, you can find an explanation in the description, so check that out if you need to. Alright, let's get to our first black card. First up we have Ayara, First of Locthwain. She costs 3 black mana, she's a 2/3 legendary elf noble at rare, and whenever she or another black creature enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. She can also tap to sacrifice another black creature, draw a card. Well, we just had a super powerful card in Core Set 2020 that really pushed you to try to be mono-black or almost mono-black in Dread Presence. Now we have one of those in this set too, just like we do for every color, since she's part of a cycle in Throne of Eldraine of legendary creatures who represent a specific color on the plane of Eldraine. And they all really push you to play as much of their color as possible. She is really good. Draining the opponent for 1 every time you play a black creature is nice, but drawing cards by sacrificing black creatures is what really pushes her over for me. It is going to be somewhat challenging to build monocolor decks in this format, but it's going to be less challenging than it has been in more recent formats, since there are several reasons to do it here. I think if you see her pack 1, pick 1, you can take her in a lot of scenarios and try your best to have your deck be mono-black or at least mostly black, and she'll be one of the best cards in your deck. I'm giving her a B. She can easily help you take over a game. Next up we have Bake into a Pie, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a common instant. It says destroy target creature, create a food token. So food is a new mechanic in this set. Food tokens are artifacts that you can tap and pay 2 mana for, and they gain you 3 life. This is a good removal spell. 4 mana instant speed removal is already in the premium range, and the fact that this makes a food token is nice additional value. You can use that token to gain some life on a later turn, or use it with a card that takes advantage of the tokens in some other way. That's real upside attached to an already good removal spell. I think this is first pickable most of the time. I'm giving it a B. Next up we have Barrow Witches, which for 4 generic and a black or 3/4 human warlock at common. When it enters the battlefield, you return a night card from your graveyard to your hand. I love Gravedigger, and that's what this will be a decent chunk of the time. There are lots of knights in this set, with black being one of the colors where they are the most concentrated. So how often will this be a 5 mana 3/4 that gets a creature back from the yard? I think relatively often, especially if you're in another one of the night colors, which are red and white. When she's doing that, she'll be giving you a 2-for-1 with no problem. I think it is going to feel pretty great to cast these witches on turn 5. I think I want to give this a build-around grade, though I think they have a pretty reasonable floor. Probably a C in your average black deck in the format, because you at least have a few knights. But I think if you have 7 or more knights in your deck, she'll perform more like a B-. I'm not sure you ever really want more than one of these, though, since she requires a bit of setup, but I think you'll pretty much always want the first one in your black decks. Next up we have Belle of the Brawl, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 human knight at uncommon. It's got menace, and when it attacks, other knights you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. I like her a lot. 3 mana 3/2s with menace are usually C+s. They're nice aggressive creatures. Belle of the Brawl also happens to make your other knights bigger when she attacks, and that is significant upside since this set, again, is loaded up with knights in the Mardu colors. I think she's first pickable in weaker packs. I'm giving her a B-. Next up we have Black Lance Paragon, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/1 human knight at rare. He's got flash, and when he enters the battlefield, target knight gains death touch and lifelink until end of turn. I like this card a lot. Note that it can target itself and give itself death touch and lifelink, meaning that at its worst you can flash this in to kill pretty much any creature while also gaining 3 life. In exchange you will gladly take. Obviously, he can do stuff to other knights too, but because of the stat line he has, I think he'll target himself a larger chunk of the time. But yeah, he functions as a situational removal that can also beat down a bit when he needs to. You can flash it in when one of your knights is getting triple blocked and just kill everything by giving your guy death touch. I think he's good enough to first pick in a lot of packs. I'm giving him a B. Next up we have Bog Naughty, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 fairy at uncommon. It's got flying, and you can pay 2 generic and a black to sacrifice a food, and target creature gets -3/3 until end of turn. This is a pretty powerful uncommon. 5 mana 3/3 flyers are usually kind of okay on their own, but this comes with the ability to turn food into a powerful removal spell. Even if you just have 1 or 2 ways to make food, you'll play this, and most of the time, if you're in black, I think you'll end up with 3 or more ways to do it without trying too hard. If you end up with a lot of food, this becomes one of the best cards in your deck, capable of machine gunning your opponent's creatures and making combat a nightmare. I think the reasonable floor and the high ceiling here mean that you can first pick Bog Naughty relatively confidently. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we've got Cauldron Familiar, which is 1 black mana for a 1/1 cat at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, and you can sacrifice a food to return it from your graveyard directly to the battlefield. So what would a 1 mana 1/1 that drains a life be? Probably a D-. This one is an interesting food build around, and if your deck can make a critical mass of food, you have a cat that won't stay dead and will drain your opponent 1 life over and over again. This is a build around, one you should avoid unless you get like 6 or more ways to make food, because I think it's a D- without food, and probably a C in a deck with a critical mass of food. It's still not an incredible build around, but you'll definitely be playing it if you have lots of ways to make food. Next up, we have the Cauldron of Eternity, which costs 10 generic and 2 black for a Mythic Rare legendary artifact. It costs 2 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard, and whenever a creature you control dies, you put it on the bottom of its library. You can also pay 2 generic and a black and tap it, and pay 2 life to return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. This is wacky, like most of the legendary artifact cycle in this set. Obviously, you need to load up your graveyard to even cast this, at which point it can start bringing stuff back from the yard. It is a little annoying that despite how challenging this is to cast and all the limitations it already has, it also makes you put creatures that die on the bottom of your library once it's into play, and that means when it comes down, the fuel already in your graveyard is all you're going to get. On the bright side, your creatures will also come back one way or another. This starts with such a high mana cost, but the format, especially blue-black, seems to have a decent number of ways to mill itself, in which case, casting this for 5 or 7 might be very doable. It does ask you to do a lot of work to set it up, because you need the creatures in the yard to both reduce its cost and have it be able to do something once it comes into play. I think it will be too challenging to build around in this format most of the time, but I'm going to give it a build around grade. I'm going to say it's a D in your typical black deck in this format, probably too clunky and too slow. But I think in the right deck, maybe a blue-black deck that can mill itself a bunch, it's probably as good as a B. Next up, we have Cauldron's Gift, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It has Adamant, a mechanic that gives cards extra effects if you pay 3 mana of their color. In this case, if you pay 3 black mana, you get to put the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard. And then it says you may choose a creature card in your graveyard. If you do, return it to the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. I think this is probably just decent and not much more. 5 mana to reanimate something with a +1/+1 counter isn't a great deal. We have seen this effect before and it hasn't been impressive. Those spells are too situational because your graveyard needs to be stocked in the first place. And yeah, this helps you if you get Adamant going by milling some of your cards, but I still don't like how situational this is for the most part. I think it's just a C. Next up, we have Clackbridge Troll, which for 3 generic and 2 black is an 8/8 troll at rare. It's got trample, it's got haste. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent creates 3 0/1 white goat creature tokens, and he says at the beginning of combat in your turn, any opponent may sacrifice a creature. If a player does, tap Clackbridge Troll, you gain 3 life and you draw a card. The design here is super flavorful, and I also think it is a pretty great card. It reminds me a little bit of Desecration Demon, and that's probably a good place to be. Your opponent will get goats to sacrifice to this guy and everything, but if he's drawing you a card and gaining you 3 life every time they do, you're still going to come out ahead most of the time. There will be some rare occasions where he just isn't enough to help you stabilize, but you're going to get there most of the time. I think it's just a bomb. I'm giving him an A-. Next up, we have Epic Downfall, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It says exile target creature with converted mana cost 3 or greater. This is a good removal spell. You're guaranteed to always trade up with it, and I like that. Sure, it can't kill little guys, but all decks will have plenty of creatures with converted mana cost 3 or higher, and this will feel great when you cast it. So basically, it is sort of situational, but not to the point that it isn't premium. 2 mana for this effect is just great, and I think you first pick this most of the time. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we have Eye Collector, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 flying fairy at common. When it deals combat damage to a player, each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. I'm not super impressed with this, with the caveat that it might be kind of okay in a deck that really wants to load up your graveyard or your opponent's graveyard. But in general, 1-mana 1/1 flyers that don't do anything else, and this mostly doesn't do anything else, aren't that good. They're too easily outclassed and often just sit on the board doing nothing, even in the early game. I'm giving this a D+. Next, we have Festive Funeral, which for 4 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard. 5 mana for this effect is a lot. Sure, there are ways to load up your graveyard we've already seen, but to really feel good about the investment, you probably need 5 or more cards in your graveyard. And sure, you can't cast it until later anyway, so your graveyard will have stuff in it. But don't be surprised by the times where you just can't make use of this card because you can't hit your 5th land, or your graveyard doesn't have enough creatures to kill that 5/5. Those things are going to happen about as often as it does well, and I think because of that, this is a removal spell you'll only really run if you don't have other ones. There are plenty of better black removal spells, even for a deck that's loading up their graveyard, that are more efficient and less conditional. I'm giving this a C. Next up, we have Foreboding Fruit, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and you draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, and it has Adamant. If at least 3 black mana was spent to cast it, you get a food token. Black card draw spells like this are pretty much always a reasonable inclusion as a 1-of. The card on the face of it is a 2-for-1, but you do have to be careful since it doesn't impact the board at all, and sometimes doing this early can be dangerous when you could be playing a creature that will help you survive. The Adamant here is a nice bonus, but it doesn't add a ton to the card, though it will be nice gaining life back after you cast this. Yeah, this is something you won't usually want more than 1 of, but the first copy will always be fine, and that makes it a C. Next up, we have Forever Young, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says put any number of target creature cards from your graveyard on top of your library, draw a card. This is kind of like a black Anticipate. For 2 mana, you aren't really gaining card advantage, but you will be improving your future draws, and you will draw one of the cards you put on top right away. Sometimes it will feel amazing because of cards in your graveyard, other times it won't do much, but hey, you get to draw the card either way, so the fail case could be worse. You still get to cycle it, basically. This is the kind of effect people frequently overrate because their mind immediately goes to the scenario where you put your bomb on top of your deck, but there will certainly be times you have this and nothing in your graveyard is worth putting on top. So I think this is mostly filler, and sometimes you'll cut it. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Foulmire Knight, which is 1 black mana for a 1/1 zombie knight at uncommon. It's got Death Touch, and it can go on adventures. Its adventure is Profane Insight, an instant that says you draw a card and you lose 1 life. So 3 mana to draw 1 and lose 1 life isn't very good. However, a 1 mana 1/1 with Death Touch is playable in every format and pretty much guarantees you're going to get a 2-for-1 because you can cast the Profane Insight part to get a card, and then the Death Touch part will allow you to trade with anything. 1 mana 1/1s with Death Touch are usually solid Cs, and this comes with some real additional upside that I think pushes it up to C+. Next up is Giant's Skewer, which for 1 generic and a black is a common equipment. It says equipped creature gets +2/+1. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a creature, create a food token, and it has equip 3. I don't love this. 2 to play and 3 to equip is not a great investment for +2/+1. And sure, it can make you food tokens, but still, I think maybe if you're in a deck that is both interested in equipment and food, you play this. But I think you have to want both to play this because it's just not very efficient. I'm giving it a D+. I'm not going to be playing it much. Next up, we have Lash of Thorns, which for 1 black mana is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +2/+1 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. This is a decent trick. +2/+1 and Death Touch means your creature will be able to kill anything, and for 1 mana you could do worse. Ideally, you don't 2-for-1 yourself and you manage to also save your creature with the toughness boost it gives you, but the small investment of 1 mana it asks of makes 2-for-1ing yourself a little less painful than it might otherwise be. Basically, at its worst, apart from your opponent killing your creature in response, its worst case scenario is that it's a more conditional Bone Splinters, and that's okay, especially because it has upside. Since it gives Death Touch to a creature, if it's being triple blocked by something, that can be completely backbreaking for your opponent as you kill all their creatures thanks to Death Touch. I think you will play this in your really aggressive decks, but not really anywhere else. Tricks have inherent risks that just won't interest grind to your decks, namely the problem of getting 2-for-1 if your opponent does anything in response. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, we have Lochthwain Paladin, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/2 human knight at common. It's got Menace and it has Adamant. In this case, if you pay 3 black mana to cast it, you get a +1/+1 counter on your Locthwain Paladin. So 4 mana for a 3/2 with Menace isn't a great rate. I think it's probably a C-. Obviously, though, this comes with additional upside thanks to Adamant, and I think a 4 mana 4/3 with Menace is probably close to a B-. Like a lot of these Adamant cards, I'm going to split the difference between the two possibilities. It will get the higher grade in a monocolored or almost monocolored deck, and a lower grade in a deck that won't consistently be able to make this Adamant, and I think giving this a C is a good way to reflect that. Next up, we have Lost Legion, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 2/3 Spirit Knight at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 2. I always like this kind of creature. Sure, it doesn't do great on the vanilla test as a 3 mana 2/3, but scry 2 is some serious value and goes a long way towards ensuring your draws are better for a little while. This means it's also useful all game long. It also has a useful creature type since it's a knight. I think all of this combines to make this a solid playable for black decks, giving it a C. Next up, we have Malevolent Noble, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 human noble at common. You can pay 2 and sack an artifact or another creature to put a +1/+1 counter on him. This is really good for a common. At the base level, it is a Grizzly Bears, but the fact it can start gobbling up creatures and artifacts, including food, means that this can get out of hand in a hurry. This is also the kind of card that makes aura-based removal look horrible, since you can still get value out of your now useless creature. I think this has such a reasonable floor and such a high ceiling that you're going to want to first pick this a lot of the time when you see it. The large amount of food tokens in black really pushes it higher than it might be in other formats that don't have artifact tokens running around. I'm giving this a B. Next up is Memory Theft, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. You may put a card that has an adventure that player owns from exile into that player's graveyard. So this is coercion with some additional upside since it can take adventures away from your opponent. When you can do that, you're kind of getting a 1.5 for 1. This also means that this can be useful even if your opponent has 0 cards in their hand, assuming they have an exiled adventure creature. Still though, paying 3 to have no impact on the board, even in your ideal scenario, is pretty sketchy. Plus, as the game goes on, this does become increasingly bad, even if your opponent has a bunch of adventures. I think this is the kind of card that maybe you side in against opponents who have big, expensive bombs that you know will be in their hand for a while, but even as a sideboard card, I don't love this. I'm going to say you should never play this in your main deck, which means it's an F, but it's maybe a D+ out of your sideboard. Next up, we have Murderous Rider, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 2/3 zombie knight at rare. It's a 2/3 with lifelink, and it says when it dies, put it on the bottom of its owner's library. It also has an adventure called Swift End. You can pay 1 generic and 2 black to cast an instant that says destroy target creature or planeswalker, you lose 2 life. This is really good. One half is basically murder, and the other side is Vampire Nighthawk. Okay, yes, neither half is quite as good as those 2 cards, but the fact that 2 cards close to those in power are on a single card is pretty awesome. The fact it goes to the bottom of your library doesn't hurt either, as if a game goes long, you know you have a kill spell waiting at the bottom that might help you win before you run out of cards. But yeah, any way you want to look at this, it's an excellent card. I think it's an A-. There aren't very many cards in the set you want to be taking over this. It's premium removal with the body, and that's hard to say no to. Next up, we have Oathsworn Knight, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 0/0 human knight at rare. It enters the battlefield with 4 +1/+1 counters on it. It attacks each combat if able, and if damage would be dealt to it while it has a +1/+1 counter on it, you prevent that damage and remove a +1/+1 counter from it. A 3 mana 4/4 is a good deal, even if it has to always attack, and this one comes with what is mostly upside. He's difficult to kill in combat. It will take 4 separate combats for him to die in most cases. More if you put some more +1/+1 counters on them, and there are a few ways to do that. He will just be a nightmare to block if he actually comes down early, because he will be the biggest thing around and blocking him won't be fun. The fact he shrinks is definitely worth the fact that he just doesn't die for a while. I think he's in the lower range of first pickable, giving him a B-. Next up, we have Order of Midnight, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 human knight at uncommon. It has flying and it can't block. It has an adventure, a sorcery called Alter Fate for 1 generic and a black, and you can return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. A 2 mana 2/2 flyer that can't block is already great in aggressive decks, and the fact that this lets you get a creature back from your graveyard is incredible. This is basically Gravedigger, who gives up the ability to block to gain flying, and that's a good trade. Especially because the adventure mechanic makes things even better than all that because of the added flexibility. This is an excellent uncommon for black. I think it's a solid B. Next, we have Piper of the Swarm, which for 1 generic and 1 black is a 1/3 human warlock at rare. It gives rats you control menace, and you can pay 1 generic and a black to make a 1/1 black rat creature token, and you can pay 2 generic and 2 black to tap it and sacrifice 3 rats to gain control of target creature. A 2-mana 1/3 that can make rats with menace is pretty great, and there are a few other rats in this set too. It will probably be kind of hard to amass 3 rats for the mind control effect, but if you ever do, you're in some serious business, and I think in a long grindy game, that's a real way you can just win the game on the spot. I like cards like this. It is decent early game as a 2-mana 1/3, and it can take over the late game as a mana sink. Not many 2-drops can do both of those things, but this one can. I think it will start to feel like a bomb in some situations, but it is still kind of small and very vulnerable, but I think I first pick it most of the time anyway. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we've got Wrinkle, Master of Pranks, who for 2 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 legendary fairy rogue at Mythic Rare. He's got flying and haste, and when he deals combat damage to a player, you choose any number of the following. The options are, each player discards a card, each player loses 1 life and draws a card, or each player sacrifices a creature. This guy seems really great and like a lot of fun. A 4-mana 3/3 with flying and haste is already probably close to a B, but add all that other text and it is even better. Sure, all the effects are symmetrical, but you get to decide which of the 3 effects triggers, and you can always choose the one or ones that are best for you and the worst for your opponent. Letting your opponent draw a card isn't awesome, but you get a chance to cast the card you draw before they do. The discard effect and sacrifice effect will frequently be nice too. Wrinkle seems like it will take over games pretty easily. Even if there are times when you don't really want to be choosing any of these effects, you still have a 4-mana 3/3 with flying and haste, which again is probably at least a B- and maybe even a solid B. I think Wrinkle is just a bomb. I'm giving him an A-. It just seems like he can completely take over games and really kill your opponent in a hurry. Next up, we have Reaper of Night, which for 5 generic and 2 black is a 4/5 Spectre at common. When it attacks, its defending player has 2 or fewer cards in hand, it gains flying until end of turn. Then it has an adventure called Harvest Fear for 3 generic and a black, that's a sorcery, and it says target opponent discards 2 cards. I keep going back and forth on this card. When I first saw it, I thought it was garbage. A 4-mana Mind Rot and a 7-mana 4/5 that will have flying sometimes in the late game. Those aren't exactly a good deal. But then, I started to think about the fact that it is a 3-for-1. The Mind Rot hits 2 cards after all, and then your creature can trade with at least a removal spell or something, and I love 3-for-1s. But I think I've concluded that I'm not that interested in this card. Mind Rot is usually not the most playable card, and that's because it becomes useless in the late game. And the idea here is, well, if they have no cards, just play this as a creature. And yeah, I guess that's an interesting design, but the creature is just so overcosted and doesn't even always have flying. Yeah, I don't think I want to run this most of the time. I'm giving it a D. Next up, we have Reeve Soul, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says destroy target creature with power 3 or less. We've seen this before. It was a nice removal spell last time, and it's a nice one this time. 2 mana to kill something's a good deal, and because this looks at power, it won't be that hard to trade up with it either. I think it falls a little short of being premium, so I don't really want to first pick it, but it is always a solid inclusion in your deck. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Revenge of Ravens, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment. And it says whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, that creature's controller loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. I'm having a particularly hard time nailing down how I feel about this card. On the one hand, I think as a 4-mana enchantment without an immediate impact on the board that it could definitely be a liability. But on the other hand, this is going to make it very difficult for your opponent to win most races against you, since the life drain for each creature that attacks you will really take its toll. This is the kind of card where I'm not going to be surprised if I'm completely wrong in either direction, because I think you really have to play with it or against it to fully understand it. But I think for now, I would say running 1 copy in your black decks is probably fine. I'm giving it a C. Again, I could see it going down to a D and going up to a B, and neither of those outcomes would really surprise me. That's how uncertain I am about this card, so, take my opinion about it with a grain of salt. Next up, we have Smitten Swordmaster, which for 1 generic and a black is a human knight at common. It's a 2/1 with lifelink, and it has an adventure. For 1 black mana called Curry Favor, it's a sorcery, and you gain X life and each opponent loses X life, where X is the number of knights you control. Like a lot of the cards with adventure, this seems pretty good. If your deck has lots of knights in it, his adventure can be absolutely devastating, and this becomes even more true because you don't even use up a card to do it. Effects like that often aren't awesome, because if you aren't killing your opponent with them, you're going down a card to not have a direct effect on the board. But this guy can come down as a 2-mana 2/1 with lifelink, which is already kind of a decent card, probably a C-, especially with the knight creature type. I think if we think of this as a 3-mana 2/1 with lifelink that does 1 to the opponent for each knight, that would be a pretty high quality card, and this is better than that in some ways. I think this is a very good common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Spectre's Shriek for 1 black mana. It's an uncommon sorcery. It says target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, that player exiles that card. If a non-black card is exiled this way, exile a card from your hand. So there's a cycle of cards in this set that hate on their own color. They're color hosers, but for the same color as the spell. We saw the white 3/2 as protection from white, and we saw the blue card that is a 3-mana mana link, but a 1-mana mana link against blue spells. And we have a really interesting design on this one. I think this may be my least favorite of this cycle, because most of them you can just play in your deck on a base level and not feel too bad about it. But that's not true here. Spectre's Shriek, while efficient, is going to be god-awful against people not playing black. 1 mana and a whole card are not worth taking away a card from your opponent in most scenarios. That's 2 for 1ing yourself, and you're doing it for something that doesn't even affect the board. Now, I do think against opponents playing black, it's reasonable to side in, especially if they are the kind of deck holding onto a bunch of cards. I'm never a huge fan of discard that doesn't add to the board, even when it's this efficient, but this should probably be mostly coming out of your sideboard. I think it's an F in your main board and a C against decks with lots of black cards. Next up, we have Sir Conrad the Grim, who for 3 generic and 2 black is a 5/4 legendary creature human knight at uncommon. And whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent. He also has an activated ability, 1 generic and a black. Each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. This feels like it should have been a rare. I think a lot of this cycle actually does. And not just because they're legendary, but because they're all so complex, and he may be the most complex of all of them. A 5-mana 5/4 does alright in the vanilla test, and then this guy's massive text box is all upside. Damaging the opponent anytime a creature is put into the graveyard from someone's hand or their library is pretty good. Conrad is going to provide some nice late-game reach for decks, since he can, of course, make sure cards from the library are being milled into the graveyard, and every time you hit a creature, he's going to do some damage. I think he's just, a reasonable creature on the vanilla test with just enough upside on him to be in the lower range of first pickable. I think he's a B-. Next up, we have Tempting Witch, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/3 human warlock at common. When it enters the battlefield, you get a food token. You can also pay 2 and tap her and sacrifice a food. Target player loses 3 life. She seems alright to me. A 3-mana 3/1 is not good on the vanilla test, but she also gives you food and is a food payoff, so I can let that slide. She can give your deck some nice reach in the late game if you have food laying around, and I can see her representing a nice clock for grindier decks in this format. Still, she's not going to be very good early, when other things that cost as much as she does can easily attack through her, and I think that keeps her from being anything more than a solid playable. I'm giving her a C. Next up, we have Wicked Guardian, which for 3 generic and a black is a 4/2 human noble at common. When it enters the battlefield, you may have it deal 2 damage to another creature you control. If you do, draw a card. So, a 4-mana 4/2 that damages one of your guys and draws you a card is sort of an interesting design. I think overall this is pretty solid. Sure, it may kill your creature, but I think a 4-mana 4/2 that sacrifices a small creature and draws you a card would be pretty solid, and this is better than that because sometimes it won't actually kill your creature at all, in which case you're just giving yourself a 2-for-1. Note, by the way, that if you play it and your board is empty, you won't be drawing a card because she has to damage something for that to happen. I think you'll play one of these in most black decks and feel fine about it. I think she's a C. Next up, we have Wishclaw Talisman, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare artifact. When it enters the battlefield, it comes into play with 3 wish counters on it. You can pay 1 generic mana and tap it to remove a wish counter and search your library for a card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. An opponent gains control of Wishclaw Talisman. Activate this ability only during your turn. This card gets an A+ for flavor and design, and I think an F for limited. Tutor effects can already be too clunky for limited, but this one is actually pretty efficient and gets you multiple cards. But the fact that you don't even get to do it all 3 times kind of ruins this card for me. Granted, if you did get to do it all 3 times, it would probably be a little too good. And still, you're going to be netting 2 cards with it, and your opponent will get 1, so maybe you can come out ahead. But if your opponent has a huge bomb, you just handed it to them. I don't think I want to play this card in the format at all. F it is. And our last card is Witch's Vengeance, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery. And it says creatures of the creature type of your choice get -3/-3 until end of turn. I like this. There are some rather common creature types in this format, with knight being the most common, but others like fairy, rogue, soldier, elves, and humans are also pretty common. I think you're happy with this, even if you just kill 1 thing of your opponent's, and obviously, you can usually make that happen. If they have multiple creatures with the same type, it starts to get silly, even if it's just 2. The downside is that it also affects your creatures with the chosen creature type, but I think since you control what creature type you name, you can always make sure that this works best for you and the worst for your opponent. I think all of that makes us a frequently first pickable card and a B. So that's my take on all the black cards in Throne of Eldraine for limited. Come back tomorrow to see me talk about all the red cards in the set. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review as well as Throne of Eldraine draft videos in the near future, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're trying to find the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.